Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as we conclude this month's study of the book of Ruth. Today we'll be taking a look at chapter 4, and the writers give us a central question, which is, what obligations has God given us to fulfill? I was reminded as I began doing this study this week of my early days and experiences as a young adult in Sunday school. I can remember Kathy and I, right after the birth of our first daughter, joining a group of adults, and I can remember the excitement of studying God's Word and seeing the practical wisdom and guidance that was available, and how full I would feel after leaving the class each Sunday. I also was inspired by the community of other believers as we gathered each week in the ministry amongst ourselves and to the world. I had a pretty good idea that I wanted to join God in this work, but it wasn't until we moved to Texas that that opportunity came. And for the last 30 years, I have been very blessed to have been involved in adult Sunday school ministry. It's not always been easy. At times, it's felt like a challenge. At times, it's felt like a duty or an obligation. It's not always been joyful. But I have to tell you that anytime we're obedient and we fulfill the obligations that God lays upon us, there's always blessing now and into the future. The book of Ruth is all about obedience and obligations, and it challenges us to consider what obligations God has laid before us to fulfill. Also, it reminds us of the blessings that come from God anytime we're obedient and we do fulfill those obligations. Let's take a look back to chapter 1 and recap some of the examples of obligation. Well, we have Naomi, who's on her way back to Bethlehem after losing her husband Elimelech and her 2 sons. With her are her 2 daughter-in-laws. And Naomi senses the obligation not to have these young women fulfill their obligation by following her back and what that would mean for their young lives. And so out of a sense of obligation and duty to these 2 young women who have been good to her as daughter-in-laws throughout all of the tragedies that they have mutually shared, she encourages them to go back to their families, go back to their gods, go back and find husbands. Their lives still have much to be lived for. And then we have the obligation that Ruth feels towards her mother-in-law, and the commitment that she makes to follow her back despite Naomi's encouragement not to. And we see Ruth making the commitment to follow her no matter what, as we saw in the great vow back in chapter 1. Then we see, once they get to Bethlehem in chapter 2, we see Ruth sensing the obligation to take care of her mother-in-law by going out and gleaning in the fields. We then see the obligation Boaz feels and the kindness that comes from that obligation once he realizes who Ruth is and the story of how she had been faithful to her mother-in-law. Boaz shows her extreme kindness, obligated to do that over and beyond just what the law required. And then we see in chapter 3, Naomi sensing the need to provide security for her daughter-in-law, and so coming up with a plan for Ruth to go to Boaz at the threshing floor. We see Ruth following through on that plan, maybe out of a sense of obligation to provide security long-term for both her and her mother-in-law. And then we see in today's lesson Boaz accepting the obligation of kinsman redeemer and marrying Ruth. Of course, the reality is when we choose to fulfill our obligations, we're choosing to not do something else. When we say yes to one door, we're saying no to another. And there is a cost to fulfilling obligations. We see in our lesson today, in chapter 5, that Boaz points out to the next of kin, hey, if you're going to acquire the land, you also will be acquiring the widow. And upon further reflection, the next of kin chooses not to do so. He says it could endanger his inheritance. Can we blame him? Can we relate to him? It's true at times the obligation that is laid before us can seem to be too costly. Jesus said to his disciples, "Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." The price is high of discipleship. One of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what's at stake anytime we deny to be obedient and to fulfill our obligations? Well, there's always a cost to fulfilling our obligations, but the greater cost often is in the denial of fulfilling those obligations. Ruth and Boaz get married. The townspeople and the elders shower each with blessings. But we know the rest of the story. God was able to bless this couple, and from this couple comes the lineage of Jesus. It's a reminder to us of how God works in the world, often through ordinary events and ordinary people, always looking to work through people who are willing to fulfill whatever obligations are laid before them. Well, as we conclude our study of Ruth, let's go back to the opening question, which is, what obligations has God given me to fulfill? My prayer for you is that you'll be able to ask that question and find an answer, as well as have the courage to follow through in obedience, knowing that God works through our ordinary lives to produce the work that is his plan in the world, and that we can be blessed being a part of that. Well, please come back again next week when we begin a 5-week lesson during the Advent season, beginning with Isaiah. Until then, I hope you have a great week. God bless you. We'll see you again next time.